Picture yourself standing in the suffocating shadows of the Alcazar of Madrid on November 6, 1661. The air is thick with incense, but there is another smell underneath it, something metallic and wrong. Through those heavy oak doors, Queen Mariana of Austria is giving birth, and the midwives have gone silent. That silence tells you everything, because when healthy Barbies are born, there's crying. When sick Barbies are born, there's urgency. But when something else emerges, something that challenges the very definition of human, there's only silence. The Queen knows what she's creating. She has to know, because the man packing outside those doors isn't just her husband. He's her uncle, her mother's brother, a man 30 years older than her, who she was forced to marry when she was just 15 years old. And this isn't even the worst part of the story. You see, Queen Mariana wasn't supposed to marry her uncle originally. She was betrothed to his son, her cousin, Prince Bassar Charles. But when the prince died, the Spanish court didn't send her home. They didn't find her another match. They simply reassigned her to his father, like she was property being transferred between family members. And now, 6 years into this marriage that would be illegal in any modern country, she's giving birth to the culmination of 2 centuries of the most disturbing genetic experiment ever conducted by European royalty. What emerges from Queen Mariana's womb on that November day isn't just a baby. It's Charles II of Spain, and his very existence will prove that there are some things worse than death, some things worse than never being born at all, because Charles II will live 39 years of continuous suffering, trapped in a body that's the direct result of his family's obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. This wasn't an accident. Every single marriage that led to Charles II was calculated, planned, orchestrated by people who could see what was happening to their bloodline and chose to continue anyway. They watched as each generation became more deformed, more disabled, more obviously damaged, and their response was to double down on the very practice that was destroying them. To understand the true horror of what happened in that birthing chamber, we need to go back to the beginning of the Habsburg dynasty's genetic experiment. An experiment is the right word, because what the Habsburgs did to themselves was as deliberate as any scientific study. Just with human beings as the test subjects and political power as the goal. It starts with a phrase that would become the Habsburg motto: Belligerant Ali to Felix Austria noob, let others wage war, you happy Austria shall marry. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? But this wasn't about love. This was about accumulating power through strategic marriages, and the Habsburgs discover something that would ultimately destroy them. The easiest person to trust with power is family. Think about it from their perspective for a moment. If you marry your daughter to a foreign prince, she might produce heirs loyal to that foreign power. But if you marry her to her cousin, her uncle, even her nephew, those children remain within the family circle. The power stays concentrated. The wealth doesn't disperse. The bloodline remains pure. It's a perfect strategy, except for one catastrophic problem that the Habsburgs either didn't understand or chose to ignore. Every human being carries between 5 and 10 lethal recessive genes. These are genetic mutations that would kill you if you got 2 copies, one from each parent. But here's the thing about recessive genes. They hide. They lurk in your DNA, passed down through generations, causing no problems as long as you only have 1 copy. But when relatives have children together, the chances of a child getting 2 copies of the same lethal gene increase dramatically. When first cousins have children, those children have a 6.25% higher chance of genetic disorders than the general population. That might not sound like much, but the Habsburgs weren't content with simple cousin marriages. They practiced what geneticists now call repeated consanguinity, where multiple generations of relatives intermarry, concentrating those lethal genes more and more with each generation. But wait, it gets worse. Much worse. The Habsburgs didn't just marry cousins to cousins. They married uncles to nieces. They created family trees so tangled that court genealogists had to invent new terms to describe their relationships. Philip IVTH of Spain, Charles II's father, wasn't just married to his niece Mariana. She was also his first cousin once removed through another line, and his second cousin through yet another line. They were related to each other in 4 different ways. The disturbing truth is that the warning signs were there from the beginning. The famous Habsburg jaw, that distinctive facial deformity that appears in every royal portrait, wasn't just a family trait. It was a visible marker of genetic damage, a recessive gene expressing itself more and more strongly with each inbred generation. Charles V, who ruled in the early 1500s as the most powerful man in Europe, already showed significant signs of genetic damage. Contemporary accounts describe a man who couldn't close his mouth properly. His jaw protruded so far forward that his teeth couldn't meet. He drooled constantly. His speech was so garbled that even native Spanish speakers needed time to understand him. And this was considered mild compared to what was coming. But here's where the story takes a truly dark turn. Charles V knew something was wrong. He could see it in the mirror. He could feel it in his body. His digestive problems were so severe that he spent the last years of his life in agony. Yet when it came time to arrange marriages for his children, he chose family members. His son Philip II would marry his first cousin. The genetic experiment continued. Philip II of Spain took the Habsburg breeding program to new extremes. He married 4 times and 3 of those marriages were to blood relatives. But it's his 4th marriage that should have been a warning to everyone about where this was heading. In 1570, at age 43, he married Anna of Austria. She was 20 years old. She was his niece. And the children they produced would carry the genetic burden forward into the next generation. Court physicians at the time noticed something disturbing about the royal children. They were documenting symptoms without understanding the cause. They wrote about children who couldn't walk properly, who had difficulty speaking, who suffered from mysterious ailments that seemed to affect multiple systems at once. They called these conditions divine tests or heavenly trials. They were actually seeing the progressive concentration of harmful recessive genes. The mathematics of this genetic catastrophe are precise and terrifying. Each time relatives reproduce, they increase something called the inbreeding coefficient. A normal, unrelated couple has an inbreeding coefficient near 0. First cousins who marry produce children with a coefficient of 0.0625, but the Habsburgs weren't doing single-generation inbreeding. They were stacking it generation after generation, creating a mathematical progression toward genetic disaster. By the time we get to Philip IVTH, Charles II's father, the Habsburg bloodline had become a genetic time bomb. Philip IVTH's own inbreeding coefficient was already dangerously high. He showed clear signs of genetic damage. The Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that eating was difficult. His mental capacity, while not severely impaired, showed troubling signs. He had difficulty with complex reasoning. His judgment was often poor. And yet, when it came time for him to marry, the Spanish court looked within the family once again. The marriage negotiations that led to Philip IVTH marrying his niece Mariana are documented in letters that survive in the Vatican's secret archives. And these documents reveal something horrifying. Everyone involved knew this was dangerous. The papal dispensation required for the marriage includes warnings from church officials about the dangers of such close unions. Medical advisors wrote about the risks to potential offspring. Yet the marriage went ahead anyway. Think about what this means. The most powerful people in Spain with access to the best medical knowledge of their time chose to proceed with a marriage they knew would likely produce damaged children. They prioritized political power over human well-being. They chose dynasty over decency. Mariana of Austria was 15 years old when she married her 44-year-old uncle. Court records describe a terrified young woman who cried through her wedding ceremony. She had been educated. She understood Latin, mathematics, and history. She knew what happened when relatives bore children together. She had seen the portraits of her relatives, watched the progression of the Habsburg jaw, noticed how each generation seemed weaker than the last. Her wedding night was overseen by physicians who were instructed to ensure successful consummation, despite what they delicately called the challenges of consu. What were these challenges? The psychological trauma of being forced to couple with your uncle. The physical revulsion that the body naturally feels when confronted with genetic relatives as sexual partners. Evolution has built safeguards into human psychology to prevent exactly what the Habsburgs were forcing. But it goes beyond just the wedding night horror. Mariana's pregnancies were nightmares that revealed the genetic catastrophe unfolding in real time. Before Charles II, Mariana had already endured multiple pregnancies that showed just how damaged the Habsburg bloodline had become. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The court records hidden for centuries describe a fetus so deformed that the midwives immediately burned it rather than let anyone see it. They called it a monster, using that exact word in official documents. Her second pregnancy produced a son named Philip Prospero. He lived 4 years, but those 4 years were continuous suffering. He couldn't walk properly. His immune system was so compromised that common childhood illnesses nearly killed him repeatedly. He had seizures. He couldn't speak clearly. When he finally died in 1661, the entire court knew that the Habsburg line was in serious trouble. But here's where the story becomes truly incomprehensible to modern minds. After losing child after child to genetic disorders, after seeing the obvious deterioration of their bloodline, the Spanish court's response was to pressure Mariana to try again. They didn't look outside the family for fresh genetic material. They didn't consider that maybe, just maybe, an uncle and niece shouldn't be having children together. They simply demanded that Mariana keep trying until she produced a male heir that survived. The pressure on Mariana was immense. Spain was still a global superpower, controlling vast territories across Europe and the Americas. The empire needed an heir. The dynasty needed continuation. And so Mariana, trapped in a marriage to her uncle, watching her children die from genetic disorders, was forced to become pregnant again and again. By the time she was pregnant with Charles II, Mariana was desperate. Secret letters to her confessor reveal she was taking increasingly dangerous measures to ensure this child survived. She was drinking potions made from ground pearls and mercury, believing they would strengthen the baby's blood. She was praying to obscure saints, making promises to God that if this child lived, she would dedicate her life to the church. She was consulting not just physicians, but folk healers, astrologers, anyone who might have an answer to the genetic curse destroying her children. The pregnancy itself was torture. Mariana bled constantly. She had seizures, possibly from the mercury she was consuming. Her belly grew in strange asymmetrical ways that made physicians fear the child was malformed in the womb. Labor lasted 3 days. 3 days of agony, while the court waited to see what would emerge from this union of uncle and niece, from this culmination of 2 centuries of inbreeding. When Charles II finally emerged on November 6, 1661, the reaction of everyone in the room tells us everything we need to know. The midwife who delivered him, Maria Diagrada, later wrote in her sealed confession that she had delivered the punishment of God upon the House of Habsburg. The court physician Antonio recorded that the child appeared to have been assembled from parts that didn't quite match, as if God took pieces from different creatures and forced them into human form. Let me paint you a picture of what they saw based on contemporary accounts that were hidden for centuries in various European archives. The infant's head was nearly twice the size it should have been, not just large but misshapen, with visible bulges where the skull plates hadn't formed properly. His eyes bulged from their sockets and moved independently. One might look at you while the other rolled back into his skull, but the jaw, that famous Habsburg jaw, had reached its most extreme form in Charles II. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that his mouth couldn't close. His tongue swollen and purple lulled out constantly. This wasn't just a cosmetic issue. This infant couldn't feed properly. He couldn't swallow normally. From his first moments of life, simply existing was a struggle. The body was even more disturbing. His limbs were different lengths. His spine curved in ways that suggested he might never walk properly. His fingers and toes showed webbing not complete, but enough to be noticeable, and his genitals were so underdeveloped that the physicians initially couldn't determine if the heir to the Spanish throne was male or female. The court had prepared for a potentially disabled child. They had experience with Habsburg births. Previous generations had produced their share of children with physical and mental disabilities, but Charles II exceeded their worst fears. This wasn't just disability. This was something that challenged their understanding of what human beings could be. The baptism of Charles II was performed immediately, not out of religious devotion, but out of fear. He wouldn't survive long enough for a proper ceremony. The priest who performed the baptism later wrote in his private journal that he wasn't sure if he was blessing a child or exorcising a demon. He described being afraid to touch the infant, afraid that whatever curse had created this creature might be contagious. Charles II's childhood was a masterwork of denial and horror combined. The Spanish court created an elaborate fiction that the prince was merely delicate. They issued proclamations about his improving health, even as anyone who saw him could tell he was profoundly disabled. They commissioned portraits that minimized his deformities, instructing artists to paint him from angles that made his jaw seem less pronounced, his eyes more focused, his body more proportional. But the reality behind palace walls was nightmarish. Charles didn't speak his first word until age 4, and that word was Julie, which means it hurts in Spanish. Think about that for a moment. The very first word this child managed to speak was an expression of pain. It would define his entire existence. He didn't walk until age 8, and even then only with leg braces hidden under specially designed robes. His muscle tone was so poor that he couldn't support his own body weight properly. He would collapse without warning, his legs simply giving out. The court developed an elaborate system of hidden supports in every room where he might appear, things he could grab onto when his body betrayed him. His education was impossible. Tutors reported that he would stare at books without any sign of comprehension, drooling onto the pages until the ink ran. He couldn't understand basic mathematics. He allegedly once asked why 2 plus 2 couldn't equal 5 if he was the king, showing not childish willfulness, but a fundamental inability to grasp abstract concepts. Languages were beyond him. His own Spanish was so garbled that courtiers developed a kind of translation system, pretending to understand rather than constantly asking him to repeat himself. Foreign ambassadors reported that meeting with the young prince was an exercise in confusion and embarrassment, as he would make sounds that weren't quite words, gestures that didn't quite communicate, while everyone pretended this was normal royal behavior. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. As Charles reached puberty, the court became obsessed with whether he could produce an heir. The continuation of the Habsburg line depended on this genetically destroyed child somehow fathering children of his own. Monthly examinations were conducted by court physicians who would measure, prod, and document the development or lack thereof of his reproductive organs. These reports, so explicit that they're still restricted in Spanish archives, paint a picture of a body that was failing to develop in every possible way. In 1679, when Charles II was 18 years old, they married him to Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was 17, beautiful, intelligent, and completely unprepared for what awaited her. The French court had been told Charles was delicate. They had been shown carefully edited portraits. They had been given vague assurances about his improving health. They weren't told that he screamed in his sleep, that he ate his own hair, that he sometimes forgot who he was for days at a time. Marie-Louise's first meeting with her husband-to-be was documented by several witnesses, and their accounts are heartbreaking. She walked into the room expecting to meet a king. What she found was something that barely seemed human. Charles II was propped up in a chair, held in place by hidden supports. His mouth hung open, drool running down his chin. His eyes moved independently, one focusing on her while the other rolled aimlessly. When he tried to speak to greet her, the sounds that emerged weren't recognizable as words. French ambassador reported that Marie-Louise went pale, then began to shake. She had to be physically supported to prevent her from fainting. She knew in that moment that her life was over, not in the dramatic sense, but in the very real sense that she was now bound to spend her remaining years married to someone who wasn't fully human. The wedding night was a catastrophe that the Spanish court tried desperately to manage. Charles II didn't understand what was expected of him. His physical deformities made normal relations impossible, but beyond the physical issues, he seemed to lack any understanding of human intimacy, of the emotional and physical connections between husband and wife. The court brought in instructors, courtesans, who were paid enormous sums to try to teach the king what marriage meant. These women later reported that it was like trying to teach a corpse to dance. For months, the court forced them to attempt consummation. Physicians were present, offering guidance. Priests prayed over their bed. The Queen Mother, Mariana, sometimes sat in the room weeping as she watched her son fail to understand what was happening. The psychological torture this inflicted on Marie-Louise is hard to imagine. A 17-year-old girl far from home, forced nightly to lie with someone who drooled on her, who cried like a child, who had seizures during their attempts at intimacy. Marie-Louise's letters home, discovered in the 1950 seconds in a private French collection, are devastating to read. She wrote, They make me lie with a creature that is not quite human. He drools on me. He cries. He doesn't understand what marriage means. Last night, he had a seizure while attempting to fulfill his duty, and I thought he would die on top of me. I prayed he would. While Charles II officially ruled Spain for 35 years, the reality was that Spain was a kingdom without a king. Charles couldn't read state documents because his eyes wouldn't focus properly. He couldn't sign his name consistently because his hands shook too badly. He couldn't sit through state dinners without soiling himself, requiring specially designed chairs with hidden chambers beneath them. Foreign ambassadors' reports from this period read like dispatches from a surrealist nightmare. The French ambassador wrote that Charles II was less capable of rule than a child of 3. He described council meetings where the king would play with toys, suck his thumb, and occasionally make animal noises while ministers tried to discuss matters of state. The Dutch ambassador was even more direct, writing that Charles II was a living corpse who shambled through the palace making inhuman sounds. The government functioned through an elaborate puppet show that everyone participated in, but no one acknowledged. Ministers would present decisions to Charles II, physically move his head in a nodding motion, and declare, "The king has spoken." Foreign dignitaries were coached before meeting him. Never expect a response. Never look directly at his face. Never show disgust at the smell. Because Charles II's body odor was reportedly overwhelming, a combination of poor hygiene, constant drooling, and the various medical conditions that plagued him. But it goes beyond just the inability to rule. Charles II's condition created a power vacuum that various factions tried to fill. His mother, Queen Mariana, attempted to rule through him, but she was Austrian, foreign, and distrusted by Spanish nobles. Various ministers and advisors fought for control, creating a government that was constantly in chaos. Unable to make consistent decisions or maintain coherent policies, the Spanish Empire, which had once been the most powerful force in Europe, began to crumble under this non-leadership. Colonial governors realized that orders from Madrid meant nothing, that there was no real authority backing them up. They began operating as independent rulers, siphoning off wealth that should have gone to Spain. The military, once feared across Europe, became a joke. How could soldiers respect a chain of command that led to Charles II? As Charles II aged, his body didn't just decline, it seemed to decompose while he was still alive. By his 20s, he had lost most of his teeth. The few that remained were black and rotted. His breath was so foul that courtiers would stuff their noses with cotton soaked in perfume before approaching him. Even then, many reported feeling physically ill from the smell. The Habsburg jaw continued to grow more pronounced as he aged, eventually becoming so extreme that his lower jaw extended several inches beyond his upper jaw. This made eating nearly impossible. He had to be fed lying on his back with liquids and purees poured down his throat. Even this was dangerous as he frequently choked, requiring constant supervision during meals. His seizures increased in both frequency and violence. During one episode in 1694, he bit off part of his own tongue. The bleeding was so severe that physicians thought he would die. He survived, but his already incomprehensible speech became even more garbled. After another seizure, he was blind for 3 days, screaming in terror the entire time because he couldn't understand what had happened to him. But perhaps most disturbing were what courtiers called his absences. Charles II would sometimes stop moving entirely, freezing in whatever position he was in for hours at a time. His eyes would remain open, but completely vacant. He wouldn't respond to any stimulus, not even pain. Then suddenly, without warning, he would return, often screaming or crying with no memory of the lost time. Modern physicians studying the accounts suggest these might have been severe seizures affecting the temporal lobe, but to contemporary witnesses, it seemed like his soul was leaving his body. The court physicians tried everything they could think of to treat him, but remember, this was the 17th century. Their treatments often made things worse. They bled him regularly, weakening his already fragile body. They fed him mercury, believing it would strengthen his constitution. They applied hot irons to his skin to draw out evil humors. Each treatment was torture, and none helped because the problem was in his DNA in every cell of his body. When Marie-Louise died in 1689 at age 26, officially from appendicitis, but possibly from the sheer stress of her situation, The Spanish court immediately began searching for a new wife for Charles II. The empire still needed an heir. No matter how impossible that seemed, they found Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a famously fertile family. Her mother had borne 23 children. Surely, the court reasoned such fertility would overcome Charles's difficulties. Maria Anna was tough, pragmatic, and thought she knew what she was getting into. Her diary, discovered in a German castle in 1987, reveals she was wrong. The reality exceeded her worst expectations. She wrote about Charles II, believing he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He insisted on being carried everywhere on silk pillows. He would forget who she was and scream for hours that she was a demon sent to steal his soul. His eating habits became even more bizarre. He would only eat white foods, believing that colored food contained poison: milk, rice water, ground bones. These were the only things he would consume. His body, already emaciated, became skeletal. You could count every bone through his skin. His head looked enormous on his wasted frame, like a skull with skin stretched over it. The sexual situation with his second wife was even worse than with his first. By this point, Charles II seems to have developed a fear of physical intimacy. He would scream when Maria Anna tried to touch him. He would hide under the bed when she entered the room. On the rare occasions when he attempted to fulfill his marital duties, witnesses report it was more like an attack than intimacy. He would bite, scratch, and make animal noises, then collapse crying for his mother. Maria Anna's response was to essentially give up. She withdrew from court life, spending her time preparing for widowhood. She knew Charles II would die without producing an heir. She knew Spain would descend into chaos. Her only concern became positioning herself to survive the coming catastrophe. By 1698, everyone knew Charles II was dying. The question wasn't if, but when, and what would happen to Spain when he did. European powers circled like vultures. The War of Spanish Succession was already being planned while Charles II still lived, various countries positioning their candidates for the Spanish throne. Charles II himself became obsessed with the idea that he was cursed. He hired exorcists who performed increasingly bizarre rituals. He was fed oil from holy lamps. He was bathed in wine blessed by dozens of priests. Sacred relics were pressed against his deformed body until they left marks. He believed that if he could just find the right ritual, the right prayer, the right relic, he could be cured. His paranoia reached extreme levels. He became convinced that everyone around him was trying to poison him. He would only eat food prepared by one specific servant, and even then, he would make that servant taste everything. First, he would examine his food for hours, looking for signs of contamination. Sometimes he would refuse to eat for days, convinced that starvation was better than poisoning. The hallucinations began in his final years. He saw dead relatives visiting his chamber. He claimed his father, Philip IVTH, sat on his bed each night, telling him he had failed as a king. He saw demons in shadows, angels weeping blood, the walls breathing like living things. Whether this was mental illness, the result of his brain literally deteriorating, or mercury poisoning from his various treatments, we'll never know. His last coherent moments were spent trying to decide who should inherit Spain. He had no children. He would never have children. The Habsburg line would end with him. Various European powers pressured him to name their candidates as his heir. In his confusion and illness, he changed his will multiple times, each change potentially triggering a different war. When Charles II finally died on November 1st, 1700, just 5 days before his 39th birthday, the court physicians performed an autopsy that revealed the full extent of his genetic destruction. The report, hidden in the Spanish royal archives and only fully released in 1980, is one of the most disturbing medical documents ever recorded. According to the physicians, his body did not contain a single drop of blood. Now, this is physically impossible. But what they likely meant was that his blood was so thin, so lacking in normal components, that it didn't seem like blood at all. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn, probably meaning it was severely atrophied. His lungs were corroded, full of holes and damaged tissue. His intestines were putrid and gangrenous, rotting while he was still alive. He had a single testicle, black as coal, completely non-functional, but the most disturbing finding was his brain. The physicians noted it was full of water, what we now recognize as hydrophilies. His skull was literally filling with fluid, putting pressure on his brain. Tissue, this explains the seizures, the mental deterioration, the periods of absence. His brain was being slowly crushed inside his own skull. Modern medical experts who have studied the autopsy report have identified multiple genetic disorders that Charles II likely suffered from simultaneously. Pituitary hormone deficiency would explain his physical development issues. Adrenal tubular acidosis would explain his metabolic problems. Combined immunodeficiency would explain his constant illnesses. Possibly Klinefelter syndrome would explain his genital abnormalities. Each condition alone would be debilitating. Together, they created a perfect storm of genetic catastrophe. But here's the truly horrifying revelation that modern science has given us. In 2009, geneticists analyzed DNA from Charles II's hair samples and calculated his inbreeding coefficient. Remember, normal people have a coefficient near 0. First cousins who have children together produce offspring with a coefficient of 0.0625. Children of siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. Charles II's coefficient was 0.25, 254. He was more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. He was a genetic impossibility that somehow survived for 39 years. Charles II's death triggered exactly what everyone expected. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, lasting 13 years and killing hundreds of thousands of people. The Spanish Empire was carved up among various European powers. The genetic disaster of one family became a continental catastrophe that reshaped the map of Europe. But the real legacy of Charles II is the lesson about what happens when power becomes more important than humanity. The Habsburgs knew what they were doing. Each generation saw the mounting deformities, the increasing stillbirths, the declining mental capacity. They did it anyway. They chose dynasty over decency, bloodline purity over human health, political calculation over basic biology. The women forced into these marriages suffered their own hells. Mariana of Austria married to her uncle at 15, Marie-Louise of Orleans, dying at 26 after 10 years of marriage to a husband who was barely human. Maria Anna of Neuburg, enduring years of being blamed for not producing heirs with a man incapable of reproduction. These women were prisoners of dynasty, their bodies and lives sacrificed to the Habsburg obsession with genetic purity. Modern European royalty learned the lesson. They still occasionally marry distant cousins, but never the systematic multi-generational inbreeding that destroy the Habsburgs. The ghost of Charles II haunts every royal marriage negotiation. When genetic testing became available, royal families were among the first to use it, terrified of producing another Charles II. The Spanish people, meanwhile, had to live with the consequences of being ruled by a genetic disaster for 35 years. Their empire crumbled, their economy collapsed, their military became a joke. All because their ruling family prioritized bloodline purity over competent leadership. The golden age of Spain ended not with foreign conquest, but with genetic self-destruction. In the decades and centuries after Charles II's death, the Spanish monarchy and the Catholic Church worked hard to hide the true extent of the horror. Official histories describe Charles II as delicate or melancholic. The reality that Spain had been ruled by someone severely disabled both physically and mentally was considered too damaging to national pride. But the documents survived in private collections, in foreign archives, in Vatican vaults, letters from ambassadors. Describing the king playing with toys during state meetings, reports from physicians detailing examinations that sound more like autopsies of the living, diaries of queens forced to share beds with someone who alternated between seizures and screaming. These documents, gradually discovered and released over the past century, paint a picture far worse than official histories ever admitted. The Vatican's secret archives contained particularly damaging documents, papal dispensations for the marriages with attached medical reports. Warning about the dangers of such unions, the popes knew they gave dispensations anyway. Politics trumped genetics even when the results were monstrous. Letters from Spanish bishops begging Rome to intervene to stop the marriages that were producing these damaged children, all ignored in favor of maintaining political alliances. Even more disturbing are the records of the other Habsburg children who didn't survive. The stillbirths, so deformed they were immediately burned. The infants who lived days or weeks before succumbing to genetic disorders. The children hidden away in convents and monasteries because their disabilities were too severe for public view. Charles II was just the most visible victim of the Habsburg genetic experiment. He was surrounded by the ghosts of siblings and cousins who suffered similar fates. Modern genetic science has given us tools to understand exactly what happened to the Habsburgs, and the findings are even more terrifying than contemporary accounts suggest. The inbreeding didn't just concentrate harmful recessive genes, it actually damaged the DNA itself, creating new mutations that were then concentrated through further inbreeding. Scientists studying portraits of the Habsburgs can track the progression of genetic markers through the generations. The Habsburg jaw becomes more pronounced with mathematical predictability. The eyes become more prominent and misaligned. The facial asymmetry increases. It's like watching evolution in reverse. Seeing a bloodline devolve through deliberate human action. DNA analysis of various European royal families has found traces of the Habsburg genetic damage spread throughout noble bloodlines. Charles II had no children, but his relatives did, and they carried less concentrated versions of the same genetic problems. These harmful genes were dispersed through European nobility, contributing to the health problems that plagued royal families for generations. The psychological impact may have been inherited too. Studies of inherited trauma suggest that extreme experiences can alter DNA in ways that are passed to future generations. The terror, suffering, and degradation experienced by people like Charles II and the women forced to marry these genetic disasters may have left marks on European royal genetics that persist to this day. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Charles II's story is that despite his profound disabilities, there is evidence he understood his situation. He knew he was the last of his line. He knew his body and mind were failing. He knew he was a disappointment to everyone around him. This awareness added psychological torture to his physical suffering. In his rare lucid moments, Charles II would reportedly ask why God had cursed him. He would beg to know what sin he had committed to deserve such a fate. The answer, of course, was none. He was simply the inevitable result of his ancestors' choices, a living monument to the dangers of prioritizing bloodline purity over human health. His last reported words were, "I am already nothing. Think about that." After 39 years of suffering, of being treated as barely human, of failing at every aspect of being a king, a husband, a man, his final statement was an acknowledgement of what he had always been in the eyes of those around him. Nothing, a genetic mistake that somehow survived for decades. The priests who gave him last rites reported that he seemed almost peaceful at the end, as if death was a mercy he had been waiting for his entire life. His body, that twisted product of centuries of inbreeding, finally stopped his agonized existence. The genetic experiment that had begun with such confidence in the 1400s ended with a whimper in 1700. The story of Charles II of Spain isn't just historical curiosity. It's a warning written in DNA about what happens when human beings try to concentrate power through biological means. It's proof that nature has limits that can't be violated without consequences. It's evidence that political calculation can create human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. Every portrait of Charles II that hangs in museums across Europe is a reminder of what the pursuit of genetic purity actually creates. Not superior beings, but damaged ones. Not powerful bloodlines, but destroyed ones. Not dynasty preservation, but dynasty extinction through biological self-destruction. The women who suffered in these marriages, forced to bear genetically doomed children, or blamed for not producing heirs with husbands incapable of reproduction, represent a hidden history of female trauma that we're only beginning to understand. They were prisoners of a system that treated them as breeding stock while ignoring the basic biology that made their assigned task impossible. The Spanish Empire's decline from superpower to secondary status was accelerated by having a profoundly disabled monarch for 35 years. Decisions that should have been made weren't. Opportunities that should have been seized were missed. The genetic disaster of one family became the political and economic disaster of an entire nation. Modern Europe exists in the shadow of Charles II. The borders drawn after the War of Spanish Succession still influence international relations. The fear of genetic concentration still influences royal marriage patterns. The lesson that biology cannot be subordinated to politics remains relevant in an age of genetic engineering and designer Barbies. In the Alcazar of Madrid, where Charles II was born and spent much of his tortured life, tourists now walk through restored rooms, admiring architecture and artwork. Few know that these halls once echoed with the inhuman sounds of a king who shouldn't have existed, whose every breath was testament to his ancestors' crimes against nature. The portrait of Charles II in the Prado Museum shows a face that makes viewers uncomfortable without quite knowing why. It's the uncanny valley effect of looking at something that's almost but not quite human. Children often refuse to look at it. Adults glance and quickly move on. Even in death, even reduced to paint on canvas, Charles II disturbs us on a primal level. Because deep down in our genetic memory, we recognize what he represents. The ultimate violation of biological law, the consequence of treating human genetics like a tool for power concentration, the price of believing that bloodline purity matters more than human health and dignity. Queen Mariana of Austria died in 1696, 4 years before her son. She spent her final years in religious seclusion, praying for forgiveness for sins she can never quite articulate. She knew she had participated in something monstrous. She had given birth to the living consequence of her family's genetic crimes. She had created Charles II, not through any fault of her own, but through the accumulated sins of generations of Habsburgs who chose power over humanity. In those shadowed corridors of the Alcazar, where our story began and ended, if you listen carefully on quiet nights, some say you can still hear it. Not ghosts, but something more real and more terrible. The echo of a dynasty destroying itself one marriage at a time. The sound of genetic catastrophe becoming flesh. The whisper of a bloodline that became so pure is ceased to be human at all. Charles II of Spain lived 39 years of continuous suffering as payment for his ancestors' choices. He was the bill come due for 2 centuries of genetic crime. He was the monster born from calculating that dynasty mattered more than decency, that blood purity mattered more than human health, that political power mattered more than biological law. His story reminds us that there are limits to what human beings should do to themselves and each other in pursuit of power, that nature has laws that cannot be violated without consequence, that sometimes the monster isn't the deformed child born from generations of inbreeding, but the system that created him in the first place. The queen who birthed a monster was herself a victim of that system. Forced to marry her uncle, forced to bear his children, forced to watch those children die or survive as genetic catastrophes, forced to participate in the destruction of the very bloodline she was supposed to preserve. And in the end, that's the ultimate irony of the Habsburg story. In trying to keep their bloodline pure, they destroyed it. In trying to concentrate power, they dissipated it. In trying to create a dynasty that would last forever, they created Charles II, the living embodiment of why some things should never be attempted, no matter how much power they might bring. The monster born in Madrid that November day in 1661 wasn't evil. He was inevitable. The mathematical certainty of what happens when human beings ignore biological law in favor of political ambition. He was suffering incarnate, trapped in a body that was the direct result of his family treating marriage like animal husbandry and human genetics like a political tool. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg, King of Spain, the genetic impossibility, the living consequence, the warning written in DNA, the monster born from 2 centuries of pretending that power mattered more than humanity. His story isn't just history. His prophecy about what happens when we forget that human beings have limits, that biology has laws, and that some prices are too high to pay, even for an empire that once ruled half the world. The queen who birthed a monster gave birth to a lesson that echoes through centuries. There are some things worse than losing power, some prices too high for dynasty, some monsters that shouldn't be created, even if creating them might preserve a bloodline that believed itself too pure for this world.